I do want to start with what everybody's kind of asking about more so, though, and that's the quarterbacks that Michigan is pursuing in the transfer portal. We will start with, on Monday we talked a lot about, hey, Billy Edwards Jr. from Maryland is trending away. He visited Wisconsin. That thing pretty much got locked up over the weekend. He ends up committing on Monday to the Badgers. Michigan was the favorite as soon as he entered the transfer portal, but as we wrote on Friday and then again Saturday, it wasn't a completely done deal. So there was some panic in the fan base over that. Then we see what Michigan does in shifting, right? What comes next is Dayquon Finn from Baylor, originally played at Toledo, is a guy who they bring on a visit immediately. Brendan Lewis, quarterback out of Nevada, is somebody else they'll bring in. And then Mikey Keene from Fresno State will be in this weekend, or at least is scheduled to be. He goes to Ole Miss today on Thursday. So you're seeing the quarterback board kind of come into shape a little bit. Of course, it's mutual. These guys have to want to come in and compete with Bryce Underwood. Michigan has to, have a pecking order, certainly, of which guy they like best out of these three, and could potentially expand further depending on what happens. But I guess before we get into each guy, your thoughts on how Michigan pivoted here, what they're looking at with these three guys on the board currently.
Yeah, it's not surprising. I think that we've been pretty forthright about, once, in a situation where you don't like Bryce Underwood, maybe you are in the mix a little more for the Miller Mosses of the world, the Caden Salters of the world. But you got what I think is the longer-term solution by landing him, which means, he's either going to win the job or you need a bridge guy. And it kind of, locks up that upper tier of maybe the guys that you'd want to bring in for a year, or some of these guys, maybe have 2 years of eligibility. So when you pivot down the board, I think it's hard to, kind of count on the fly. But I think when you get to Billy Edwards in our transfer portal rankings, you're looking at, I think, was around the 15th or 16th best guy available. And that was probably right now. I mean, I don't want to say he was the white whale of the process, but when you look at just how everything's gone down, he was at the top of their board. That's why they've had to pivot to some of these other guys. So you missed out on him. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. I think a lot of these guys kind of fall into the same category, but you get down to Dayquon Finn, Brendan Lewis, Mikey Keene. If I had to rank the three of them, it's probably for me still Finn, Lewis, then Keene. I don't know where you stand on that, but they're all kind of the same. Guys who, Finn didn't have the benefit of playing Big 12 football, which I think, he did. He played 2 games and I think appeared in the third. Before, he got injured this year. So, but prepared for those caliber, on a Power 4 caliber team, which I think is a good thing. And he's at Toledo. He was a guy that I think, for as many impressive wow plays as he made, there's a lot of head scratchers and things like that as well. But when you look at a guy out of Detroit who I think has a very good arm, I think moves very well with his legs, him and Brendan Lewis, for that matter, too. I think if you're looking for bridge QBs to put around Bryce Underwood, I think with guys like that, you're able to install the offense for what it would be for Bryce Underwood. And then if he wins the job, he's in there. If he doesn't, you're still repping similar things with the guy who wins the job. So like it so far, don't love it. I think that when you get to this tier of guys, I think it's more likely that we see Bryce Underwood early on than not. Whereas, maybe some of the other guys up the board, maybe hold them off for a half the year or almost the entire season. But it's to the point now where I don't think that anyone is going to go crazy about who they bring in. And everyone's going to kind of instead be waiting for that first big mistake to blow up our message board or blow up social media about needing to get Bryce Underwood in there. That's just where I'm at with it right now. So not to sound negative on it, not to sound down on it. I think there are 3 solid options available. Mikey, maybe a little bit of a gap between Finn and Lewis, and then when we get into Mikey Keene. But yeah, I'm not super surprised that the board has fallen this way, given that you have the big fish. You're in the better situation, in my opinion.
Yeah, long term for sure. And I agree. I mean, the Bryce Underwood effect is real. If you're a guy like Miller Moss or one of these other guys who are in a similar situation, a lot of the transfer quarterbacks, you see guys that kind of saw the writing on the wall that their current program was going to move in another direction, or at least allow a younger guy to come in and compete at a higher level for the starting job. Okay, I want to go somewhere I can start, I can prove myself as a potential NFL player in my final year or two of eligibility. And what's the safer place to do that at? If you're Miller Moss, it's probably Louisville that didn't have another great option. And you're not looking over your shoulder like you were with Jaden Mayava at USC this year, and then ended up getting benched and kind of scapegoated a little bit by Lincoln Riley in USC, which is having a rough time right now with their own issues in the transfer portal. So
Yikes.
I think certainly I understand that aspect of it. The Bryce Underwood effect is real. It's also the reality of, one, this was a weaker year at quarterback overall in college football. You saw a defensive player, or really a two-way player, win the Heisman. Ashton Genty comes running back in second in Heisman voting. There's not that surefire NFL guy who's going to go number one overall from the quarterback position that year. This year, maybe a trickle-down effect from that. If you look at last season at quarterback in the transfer portal, you had Dylan Gabriel go from Oklahoma to Oregon. Cam Ward sees his conference dissolve. He goes from Washington State to Miami, ends up being a Heisman finalist himself. Same with Gabriel. Will Howard kind of looking over his shoulder with Avery Johnson there at Kansas State. He can get a big bag from Ohio State. He goes from K-State to Columbus. Riley Leonard plays for Duke, can make more money at Notre Dame, way more notoriety, goes to Notre Dame, leads them to the college football playoff. And then Cal McCord, who wasn't ranked that high when he entered the portal as a transfer quarterback last year, but is actually one of the best transfer quarterbacks in the country this year. Similar situation maybe to, I'd say a Miller Moss this year, just because he did get kind of scapegoated by Ohio State last year, 2 picks against Michigan, that sort of thing.
1,000%.
Ends up doing really well at Syracuse. It's not that pool of players right now in the transfer portal. But to get back to the pool that Michigan's looking at right now, which could change, of course.
Really quick, can I
just go ahead?
Because I felt myself rambling when in our initial statement there. Let me put it pretty succinctly. I think that it's pretty clear at this point, any quarterback that transfers into Michigan this year is basically signing up for the potential that they're Kelly Bryant that gets popped by a freshman after 4 games, 5 games, whatever it is. Because I think there are more, especially from a skill set perspective, I think there are more similarities between Bryce Underwood and Trevor Lawrence than not. And a lot of people think Underwood is maybe that best QB to come through the high school ranks since him. So that's the juxtaposition here, is why are more higher end quarterbacks not interested? Higher, I use that term relatively given this year's class, because everyone thought the NIL thing was, the money cannon. They were going to fire it and get whoever they want. That's why, to me, that's why we are where we are at the moment. And I don't even think it's necessarily a bad thing. It's just this is the road that was most likely with, landing the big fish.
I agree with that. Let's go through each guy. DQ Finn out of Baylor, spent his first, 5 years of college football at Toledo. He's got 1 year of eligibility remaining. He's a Detroit native out of Martin Luther King High School. A bunch of familiarity there, a bunch of connections there. Obviously, probably knows some players on the team, knows some people around the program. This is a true dual threat. So is Brendan Lewis, who played at Colorado in Nevada and can actually run. Mikey Keene moves around in the pocket, but he does not run. He hardly scrambles. He hardly is dialed up for design runs. But Finn you can legitimately dial him up on design runs. He was the 2023 MAC MVP, completed 63% of his passes, 2,600 yards, 22 touchdowns, 9 picks, 563 yards on the ground, 7 scores rushing. He started 33 career games, a dynamic athlete, and somebody who still would have to show he could translate up to this level. Because like you said, he played 2 games as a starter in the Big 12 before suffering a rib injury. The other guy they bring in plays well enough where you're not going to go back to DQ, and you see him kind of apply now for a medical redshirt after playing in only 3 games. But certainly someone I think you could do worse than. And if you are going to have this situation where it's a 1-year rental, somebody with mobility is intriguing to me, because I think that there may not be a ton of chemistry, and you bring in all these different receivers and all that, but much like a backup quarterback in the NFL that has mobility, they can kind of figure it out on the fly without getting all those reps and having years of continuity with the guys around him. This guy could come in and do that in a 1-year situation as well. Same with Brendan Lewis, but I think Finn to more of an extent.
Absolutely. I think that's something that, and I'm not comparing Finn to JJ McCarthy by any means, but when you look at don't worry, I'll land the plane this time. When you look at what helped Michigan's offense take that next step over the last 3 years, from 2021 to 2023, it was having a quarterback that could extend plays, that could do some things with his legs. Now, with Chip Lindsey, I do think that there's going to be a little more improvisation kind of built into the offense, especially in terms of the mobility you have at the quarterback position. But Finn is a guy, I like him a ton. I like him the most of the 3 that we're going to talk about here. And I feel like this is the most I've ever written about turnover, big time throws and turnover worthy plays on Pro Football Focus. I think that's kind of a good indicator of the type of arm talent and decision making that you're working with. And he had 19 each last season. Now, a big time throw it's all subjective too. This is people grading Pro Football Focus, watching games. Big time throws, high leverage situations, tight windows, for example. Turnover worthy plays are exactly what they say they are. It's a bad read, a bad throw, and that could be a turnover regardless of a result. So you could only have maybe 5 interceptions in a season, but have 12 turnover worthy plays, something that could have been a bad decision, something that could have led to a turnover. I like when I see guys up in the the mid to upper teens, because to me that tells me that they have the arm talent to kind of make things happen on their own. And then you look at how he's able to run and move around. And I know things didn't go great last year at Baylor. Sawyer Robertson played really well for them once Finn went down injured. I'm not surprised that he popped up as a name. More so, I thought if Jason Candle had wound up as Michigan's offensive coordinator, I thought this probably would have been a done deal. But now I think he's probably their top guy available on the board. Like we said before, it's tough. It's going to be tough for them to generate a high level of interest given what they have in Bryce Underwood, which is weird to say. You'd think there'd be this gravitational pull, but this is, like we talked about the other day, a ground up rebuild on the offensive side of the ball.
And only one guy can play at that position, right?
Exactly. I mean, they're probably going to try to do the Cade JJ thing with Underwood and whoever the veteran is. But, the best thing about...
I may not make it better, though, when you're trying to entice these guys.
I get it. This is why we are where we are. Like Miller Moss didn't want to sign up for that. I'm sure other guys maybe didn't want to sign up for that. You're looking for guys that might be down for a tandem like that. And the local connection doesn't hurt. A guy out of Detroit, a guy I'm sure that, Bryce Underwood is familiar with, even just in terms of rubbing shoulders on I don't even know. Would be his 7th year in college? Bryce Underwood probably was still in elementary school when he was a freshman. Does that timeline line up?
Sure.
Anyways,
I was looking at this the other day. Bryce Underwood was born in 2007, of August of 2000. That's insane that Michigan's going to have a quarterback that was born. He missed the 2006 year, but he was born just in time for a couple notable games early September 2007 that I won't mention. But
listen, if they find a way to add Finn, I think it checks off the boxes that you're looking for in terms of a guy who's gotten good coaching, who's been productive, who started a lot of games. To me, I think you'd like to see a guy that has a little more experience at the power 4 level, but with the options on the table, that's a box I don't know that they're going to be able to check at this point. So, with a bridge guy, you probably want a few less peaks and valleys. But I think at the end of the day, if he gets good coaching, and I certainly think that playing for Chip Lindsey, playing for Sherrod Moore could be the best coaching he's gotten to this point. Maybe that does unlock one more great year or one more very good year. I don't hate it at all. I think he's a good player.
It's funny you mentioned experience at the power conference level, because the next guy has that. Brendan Lewis from Nevada was the full-time starter for Colorado in 2021 as a true freshman. He plays a couple of years there, goes to Nevada the last couple seasons, really, really turned up his game in 2024 after statistically not a great 2023 season. Not a good Nevada team. They go 3-10. He hardly has no all-conference players around him on offense. There were a few honorable mentions, including Brendan Lewis, who earned honorable mention All Mountain West honors. He completes 67.6% of his passes, 2,200 yards, 16 touchdowns, 7 picks, 775 rushing yards, 8 touchdowns on 157 carries. He took 24 sacks, but probably could have been worse than that based on his mobility. He got himself out of some jams, I would assume. And it's funny, I agree with you that it's kind of a gamble when you're taking these guys that are playing at lower levels. Of course, Lewis has the experience at Colorado. But between Finn and Lewis, there's a lot of experience overall. He's played in 39 games with 35 starts. Again, opened 12 games at Colorado in 21. Been around a long time. Kind of reminds you of a Curtis Work out of Ohio. Not in terms of how they play, but in terms of this guy knows how to quarterback. He's experienced. He knows what to do. Whereas we saw it on the flip side this year, not to knock Davis Warren, but as the Michigan radio broadcast said during one of the games late in the year, he's finally played more snaps this year than he did, or not finally, but he played more snaps this year than he did in all of high school. He wasn't that experienced. And you kind of saw that, right? Some growing pains. And, of course, the other guys that came in and played, same thing. They didn't have that experience. These guys have played in a ton of games. As Jim Harbaugh would say, they've seen a lot of balls kicked off. And you could use that to your advantage as well. But another dual threat player who was impressive on a terrible team that went 0-7 in the Mountain West this year. So it's hard to fully judge exactly what this season was for him, but was still able to be effective despite not a lot of help around him and a terrible defense statistically.
Yeah, I don't know who was doing the player grades for Brendan Lewis on PFF. I don't know if it was a family member or a friend or a Nevada super fan. Among all qualified quarterbacks, he was the 11th graded guy. 11th. They had him at, what is it here, 90.8 on the season. And you go through and you comb through his profile and you're trying to figure out where that is. And something that I like about him is that it looks like he graded out pretty highly in the intermediate game, which is kind of, in a lot of ways, sort of the bread and butter of what JJ McCarthy did well. I hate to, again, use that as the standard, but, you're looking for guys that can make the throws over the middle of the field, guys that, make some plays, throwing the deep ball too. I think he had 8 touchdowns and a little under 600 yards on passes of more than 20 yards this year. I like him too. I mean, to me, it's, I think it's adjusted for, the fact that he graded out as highly as he did with all of the things that you mentioned makes me wonder, like, if you drop him into an offense that has better infrastructure, which obviously Michigan has a lot of work to do there because offensive line needs upgrades. We know the wide receiver position needs upgrades. It looks like they're trying to bolster their run game a little bit. I wonder if he could be a Curtis Rourke type of guy where you just drop him in with a better supporting cast and see what happens. I don't think Lewis is a bad option at all. Now, again, the fact that when you see class of 2020 under a guy's photo on 3, it's kind of like, oh, well, is there more to unlock here? Is he what he is? The numbers don't jump off the page, but given that he started his career at Colorado, I am intrigued by him. I wouldn't have him ahead of Finn, like I said, but I do think that there could be something here to sort of mine with.
Mm-hmm. And I think I said true freshman in 21, redshirt freshman, but he was, if you count redshirt freshman, I think according to Colorado, he's one of the very few freshman quarterbacks who have played at that program and put up some decent numbers there. Let's move on to Mikey Keene out of Fresno State, somebody who came in here and played against Michigan on August 31st. Looked okay in that game, through the two picks. And they were overmatched, but they hung in. Most of it was Michigan's lack of productivity offensively in that game that raised some alarm bells going into the Texas game. But you are looking at the transfer portal's number 32 quarterback in the country. Another one out of the Mountain West. You do have to do some imagining as to how he would play at the power conference level, whereas, the other guys, we've actually seen it, whether it's for 2 games with Finn or several with Brendan Lewis. The one thing that's interesting about the connection here is that Chip Lindsey was his offensive coordinator at Central Florida in 2022. So high level of familiarity there. A guy who they could probably get or at least have an edge up in his recruitment just because he they do have that pre-existing relationship. This is more of your shorter quarterback, mobile in the pocket, but doesn't necessarily run, gets the ball out quick in one of those Mountain West type of offenses. And if you have a guy like Zachariah Branch at wide receiver, you can get it out to him, let him cook in space. That's neither here nor there. But your thoughts on Mikey Keene, who, again, he's one of those completion percentage guys, maybe doesn't push the ball downfield as much.
Yeah, not only is he not a runner, he has negative 379 yards in his career, which is obviously that's sacks and that's stuff weighed in there.
He was even negative this year, taking out sack yardage on design runs, negative 11 yards. So even when he was trying to run, they weren't able to go forward.
Yeah, this is, I think, of the three, you start to get in Mikey Keene territory, I think he could be a fine fit. I think he does fit, given that he's worked with Chip Lindsey before. But when we start getting to this part of the board, I wonder, are they really that much worse off if they just let, Davis Warren and Jaden Davis and Bryce Underwood kind of just duke it out? And I think that Mikey Keene, let me make one thing very clear. Like, I think you add him, he raises the floor of the room. I think he's probably a high-end QB2 that could maybe come in and start a few games early on in the year. Interesting to me about when I profiled him last night, and it was 4 games. It was, I believe, 3 starts with UCF. Chip Lindsey got his most, the highest quarterback rating out of him in those games at UCF that he's had in any other single season at 159.2. He went 60 for 83 for 647 yards with 6 touchdowns and a pick. So maybe that's a chemical mixture that, we talk about infrastructure. We talk about better play calling. You plug him in with a guy that he's played for before and you have better playmakers and a stronger run game. Maybe he can kind of replicate, what he's been at a higher profile school like Michigan. So I think that, again, the fact that I know that Sherrone Moore spoke highly of him before they played in week 1. You watch him play before then. You saw a guy that did a good job extending plays or maybe just kind of feeling out pressure and getting the ball out. Not really as much of a threat with his legs as the other 2 guys. But when you look at a guy who, outside of one season has completed around 70% of his passes each year, that's one trait to me where I think that translates. I think that's something that it tells me you're getting the ball out quick. It tells me you know how to make the right reads. And I know things speed up a little bit when you play in the Big Ten as opposed to the Mountain West. But Mikey Keene is probably the lowest, and I mean this as a compliment, and for fit at Michigan, probably the lowest end bridge type of guy that I think I would be okay with at this point, because anything further down the board, I don't think we're talking about guys that legitimately could compete for the starting job at Michigan. I think Keene is probably the lowest end of the spectrum when it comes to that. Then again, I thought maybe Maybe Billy Edwards was in that category as well. But then the board expanded and we are where we are here. So I think it works. I think that there is a fit here. I like the other two guys a little more just because they can keep plays alive. And I do have questions about Michigan's offensive line, but there is a fit here, and I could see why it might work out.
And you mentioned Davis Warren. In him, if he does come back, maybe you'd be better off going with Davis Warren. You can still do that. This is competition bringing in another guy. You have to do it. You have to. And it doesn't mean that this guy's going to come in and start whoever you bring in, but it means that you have options and not everything's riding on how fast Bryce Underwood develops or any of that. I think you need to bring in somebody. And regardless, I know you still have the spring transfer portal, although there aren't many good options, the last couple of years in the spring transfer portal. Let's say Davis Warren decides to leave then you would have really wished you got somebody. You cannot be put in another situation where you don't get somebody. And I think they know that, and they will do it.
I want to make that clear. I'm not saying if they miss on any of these three guys that we talked about to just pack up and see how things go in the spring. I think they do need to add someone. So we'll see what that looks like. I just know that, there might be guys that aren't in the portal yet. I know that the guys that are maybe a little further down the board, I don't know how much it, serves as a bridge from there. It would be more competing for QB2 or competition, which I think is good regardless. But we'll see. I suspect one of these three is going to wind up at Michigan. It just feels like that's where we're at right now.